Let's turn to chapter 4 of the book of Esther. This week, I happen to have a person who's, I don't want to say who it is, but this person happened to be in my house for Shabbos and very, very connected politically, very connected at the highest levels of the government. And the person said to me, I don't really see a point in public protest. They said, I don't see a point. What are you going to go out there and you raise your voice? What does it even accomplish? That's what the person said to me. I said, okay, you know what? You're entitled to your opinion, but we have a different opinion in the book of Esther. And that's what chapter 4 is. In the book of Esther, we have the vision of Mordechai. We're going to go through chapter 4, reading it verse by verse as we travel through the book of Esther. Mordechai yadat kol asher nasa. Mordechai knew everything that was done. What was done? He had that Achashverosh and Haman were in cahoots to do this terrible massacre of the Jewish people that Achashverosh was allowing to take place in return for all of the money that Haman was giving him. Because it says that he gave him, he says in verse 9, that if the king approves, he should write a decree to destroy the Jews. And 10,000 talents of silver I will bring to the king's treasuries. Meaning, I'll pay you 10,000 talents of silver if you allow me to kill the Jewish people. Mordechai learned about all this. The whole world was quiet. Nobody was doing anything. Vayikra Mordechai es begadav. Mordechai tore his garments. Vayabash sak va'efer. And he tore and he wore sackcloths. Vayetze b'toch ha'ir. And he went out into the middle of the city. Vayizak zaka gadol al marah. And he let out a cry of bitterness. And so this is, to my mind, the first act of civil disobedience that's recorded. Here we see that Mordechai understood, and as we see from the next verse, and he came towards the gate of the king. You're not allowed to come to the gates of the king wearing a sackcloth. Mordechai knew you weren't allowed to do what he was doing. You weren't allowed to dress like that when you come to the king. But yet he came like that specifically. Why did he do it? He knew that there was a terrible outrage, a terrible outrage in the world, and so he decided to do it, even though he knew it was against the law, even though he knew that he was going to be punished for it. Nevertheless, he said that this is important to do, and this teaches us that there are two main concepts behind the action of civil disobedience or public outcries. One are actually really three things. One is that we do it to try and raise awareness, to try and galvanize people to the injustice that's occurring. And number two, we do it because when there is an outrage in the city, we need to raise our voice, even if it will accomplish nothing, but because that there cannot be some terrible thing going on, and we just say life can go on as normal. And that's why Mordechai let out this terrible cry, even though there was no expectation that anything would happen. And the third thing is that when we do this action of civil disobedience, we do it without any expectation that we're not going to be punished. We expect to be punished for these actions of the civil disobedience. And that's what Mordechai was expecting to be punished. He went there knowing he would be punished. And that's the concept. Look at Rashi says, Mordechai yada. How did Mordechai know this information, Rashi says? So Rashi says that he had a dream. Baal hachalom amarlo. In the dream, he was told this. She'eskimu el yonam l'kach. He was told that this was decreed in heaven. And what's the reason why the Jewish people were given this punishment? So actually, the Gemara Megillah gives several different theories, but the theory that's recorded here is that's recorded here in Rashi is Lefi she'ishtachavu etzelem b'mei Nebuchadnezzar. Rashi gives two theories. One, because they bow down to an idol in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. And number two, Vishenenu Misudas Achashverosh, because they benefited from the party of Achashverosh. So this is the theory of the Gemara. But of course, if we go back to the text of the Megillah seems to blame Mordechai for these actions, because what happened was in chapter 3, verse 1, it states, after these matters, the king Achashverosh elevated Haman, and he placed him on his throne above all the princes that were with him. Now, this was deeply problematic, because if we read the book of Esther prior to this, we see that the king could not make a decision without consulting his cabinet of 7 different advisors, and they were the ones who were the lawyers, and they knew the law. And now, frivolously, he seems to have elevated Haman. And it's not the way the government is supposed to operate. The government can't just choose one person. You have to choose you have to act. Even the king had to act in a way which was consistent with the law. And so
that is a very, I wouldn't say flimsy, but very fluid and somewhat arbitrary concept in the Megillah, because, for example, later on, they have the decree. The decrees, of course, aren't even made to kill the Jews. So Mordechai and Esther tell Achashverosh, take back the decree, but he says, I can't take back the decree because it's already the law. So they have to make another decree to say that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves rather than retract the original one. So it's a very, like, it's a parody, but it's not. But it's a commentary in a way on the concept of law and of justice.
Right. So there is Elon is correct. We're joined. Elon and Guy are with us in person, and so there is this idea that the law is a little bit ridiculous sometimes, but it just shows the point of the text is that even the king is bound by the law. Even the king is bound by the law, and here the king seems to be acting beyond the law, because there were 7. The precedent in the book was that the king couldn't make a decision without the 7 advisors being consulted. And now all of a sudden, he appoints one person, and it doesn't say why, on what basis, and this person is in charge of everybody else. He says he's elevated above all the princes that are with him. Perhaps a reaction to the threat on his life, the assassination attempt that happened just at the end of chapter 2. And in reaction to that, he gets nervous, and the king elevates Haman. And now everybody there, it says in chapter 3, verse 2, all the servants of the king were bowing down to Haman, because that's what the king commanded. You have to bow down to Haman. Mordechai refused to bow down. Now, why is Mordechai refusing to bow down? At this point, the text does not tell us why he refuses to bow down. Text does not give us a reason. And the simple explanation of why Mordechai refuses to bow down would be that he's refusing to bow down because he says, who are you? You can't be elevated. You're an advisor. You're not the king. We give our allegiance to the king. You and the king has 7 advisors. You can't be one advisor above everybody else. You're not the king. So Mordechai refuses to bow down. The Midrash says that Mordechai refused to bow down because Haman had an idol that he was wearing, and Mordechai refused to bow down to it. But there's no prohibition really in the Jewish law to bow as a sign of respect to a senior political leader. It's not prohibited to bow down. And so Mordechai's action actually in the Gemara was cause for a lot of concern amongst the Jewish community, because they were blaming Mordechai for the actions that happened. So that's the Gemara talks about that. See, the Art Scroll, I'm using the Art Scroll version, and they say, quoting Rashi says that why did Mordechai refuse to bow down? That because Haman had made himself a god, and Mordechai said, I'm not going to bow down to a god. But there's no evidence of that in the text. The text doesn't say that. the text was not does not say that. Now it's ironic here. The Art Scroll edition of this, the Art Scroll is very respectful of government. It's of government. The Jewish community today is very reluctant. The Haredi world is very reluctant to protest against governments outside the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, they don't really have a problem protesting, but outside the land of Israel, very reluctant. And so they say, this is what they write here. We may surmise that since Haman was the prime minister, Mordechai would show respect to Haman in some way, but this did not satisfy Haman's vanity. This is really more of a statement about the Weltanschauung of the Art Scroll community than really the approach of Mordechai, because there's no evidence that he showed any respect to Haman. Anyway, the actions of Haman the actions of Mordechai angered Haman to such a degree that he didn't want to carry out his punishment of just Mordechai by himself, but against all the Jews. And this is another sign of anti-Semitism when we view all Jews as responsible, the entire class is responsible for the actions of some of the Jewish people. So this is something, of course, that's been a tried and true method of attacking the Jewish people. If one Jew is a dangerous landlord or a slumlord, then all Jews are slumlords. If one Jew steals from people in nursing homes, then all Jews are acting this way. That's the trope of the anti-Semites, and that's what Haman is doing here also. He doesn't want to just act against Mordechai, but he acts against all of the nation of the Jewish people. And what is his canard about the Jewish people? It has to come from somewhere. So he says that the canard against them is as follows. What's his canard? He goes to the king. And he says, Yeshno Amecha. This is the canard that he brings against the Jewish people in verse 8 in chapter 3. We're going to get back to chapter 4 in a moment. He goes to the king and he says, there's one nation, Yesh Amechad, Mifuzar Mufurad Bein Amim, that's scattered amongst all the nations, amongst all the king's provinces. And their laws are different. And they don't follow the laws of the king. So they're not willing to accept your laws. They're not willing to basically show allegiance to you. And it's not worth it to the king to keep them. So this is the threat that's being made against the Jewish people, and it has a patina of truth, because the Jewish people do have our own laws. We do have our own laws, and we are spread out. This is after the exile of the first temple, because remember, Mordechai was part of the exile of Yechaniah from Babylon into Babylon, and so there is some truth to that. But of course, he turns it into a threat against the king, who's already very insecure about his status in the world, since he just received an assassination attempt. And so therefore, in that context, we say we're going to, the book of Esther says that there's going to be an attack against the Jewish people led by Haman. And so now Mordechai, having heard this, leads the civil disobedience, but he's acting by himself. There's nobody with him at this point. Mordechai knew everything that had been done, and he tears his garments and he goes in as a lone person. You trying to say something, Elon? Yes.
Is it that Haman says, even though the text doesn't actually say that it's the Jews who are the problem, because he only says Yesha Am Echad. He doesn't actually say the name of the nation being the Jews, or is it that he's intentionally keeping it vague and just convincing Achashverosh was like, keep the money, you know what to do, you know how to make this happen.
So it's a very good point that Elon is making. The point that when Haman goes to speak to Achashverosh, he doesn't actually mention the Jewish people. He just refers to a people in general and with different laws, and that he has wide latitude to act. So that Achashverosh, like certain kings or certain leaders, they say, it's nothing to do with me. It's an action done by the people. And so that's another dispute in the Talmud, is whether or not the actions of Achashverosh as being a wicked king or a foolish king. And so if you want to say he was a wicked king, he knew what was going on, or if it's a foolish king, he said, "I don't want to know anything about it. I'm just a fool." But that's a good point that Achashverosh was not specifically told that it was the Jewish people, at least according to the text. So now, what did Mordechai do? Going back to the chapter we're studying, chapter 4, verse 2, that Vayavo ad lifnei shara melech, and he came to the gate of the king, doing this act of disobedience, ki ein lavo el shara melech bavush sak, because you're not allowed to come there wearing these clothes. So he specifically came there wearing these clothes. And now we go to verse 3. So it comes to verse 3. Medina, in every single country, the place where the word of the king and his laws reached, Evil Gadol Yudim, became a period of great mourning for the Jewish people. V'tzom u'v'chi u'misped. Dak va'efer yutzel rabim, and it was fasting and crying and wailing with sackcloths, yutzel rabim. They were spread out for the masses. All of a sudden, we see that even though other people weren't breaking the law, the Jewish people were in a period of deep communal mourning over the terrible actions that were the terrible threat that they were facing at this time. Eli, you want to say something?
Has the decree been read publicly throughout the countries, or did Mordecai just spread the word?
No, it says at the end of chapter 3, it says, "V'nishlach sfarim biyadar etzim makom medinos hamelach." But so the whole word would spread out to all over the king and to all over the kingdom, la'abed et kol Yehudim, to kill all the Jews from young to old, and that this was going to happen. So, and at that point, the king clearly knew what was going on, because it says then the king and the Haman sat down to drink, and the text literally said that they were, the text of the letter that was sent out was to kill all of the Jews, and so therefore at that point everybody was aware of it. So that's why they were aware. That's why they were praying. That's why this action was done, and that everybody was gathering. Vatavona naros Esther v'sarisea. So now Esther is sitting there, and I've seen this. I hope I don't insult anybody. I've seen this in Washington a few too many times. Esther is sitting there, and by this point, we don't really know anything that Esther has gone out of her way to not identify herself as a Jew. And Mordechai has gone out of her way to tell her not to identify herself as a Jew. And so now the young maidens of Esther came, and the assistants, and they told her, and she was very upset. What did they tell her? Now we're reading this today. Why was she upset, and what did they tell her? Now you would think, okay, they told her about the decree, and you told her that all the Jewish people are going to be destroyed, but that's not what causes her to be upset. That's not what gets her upset. That's not what they told her. They told her that your uncle Mordechai is causing problems. Your uncle Mordechai is making trouble. Is making trouble in the streets. That's what got her upset. Not what was going to happen to the Jewish people. She was upset about her reputation. That's what she was upset about. This is what happens, that here there's a decree against the Jews, and the Jewish leaders who are on the inside in the palace, they're upset that if we talk about this decree, it's going to be bad for our reputation. So that's unfortunately something I've seen with my own eyes, that when there's a tremendous threat to the Jewish people, and we bring it to the attention of the political establishment or the inside players, their concern is not the threat to the Jews, but their concern is how this is going to affect their standing within the government, within their specific role. And that's exactly what Esther's initial concern here is, "Matishlach begadim la'albish et Mordechai." And so what does she do? She sends him clothes. She says, "La'asir sako me'elav." She says, "Stop the public protest." Now, she says, "Stop the public protest and remove your sackcloths," meaning to say, "V'lo kibel," and he didn't accept it. This is Esther's response. This is Esther's response that she wants Mordechai to stop embarrassing her. Although there's another way to read this. One time I was studying it with Rabbi Weiss and Jack Lew. This is before Jack became Secretary of State and the head, Chief of Staff to the White House. And he said, no, she's inviting him to join the government and try and change it from the inside. So Rabbi Weiss and Jack were having a dispute about how they read this. Rabbi Weiss with his outsider mentality and Jack with his insider mentality. But anyway, so she's being embarrassed. V'tikra Esther Hasach. So Esther calls to Hasach. Who's Hasach? The Hasach has not appeared now, and so she calls him. So who is this person? He was in the Gemara, according to the Gemara Megillah. The Gemara says one version is, according to Rav, that Hasach was Daniel, that he had been severed from the position he held under Belshazzar, under Yavesh. And another reason was that he made chatach, he made the decisions about the state. So she sent this matter, she called Hasach, Asher Amilu Fanev Titzaveo Mordechai, Adat Mazeh V'Amazeh. And she wanted to know, she said, go to discuss this with Mordechai. I want to know what's going on here. So this to me, by the way, is a very real discussion. Why can't she go and talk to Mordechai herself? Why can't she just go and talk to Mordechai? She can't be seen with him in public. This is a man who's a thorn in the king's agenda. In Haman's agenda. She doesn't want to ruin a reputation with Haman. So she says, let's have back channel negotiations with Mordechai from Hasach. So what happened now? So Hasach went to Mordechai to the streets. Mordechai was in the streets. And so now Mordechai told him, Hasach, everything that had happened. Ve'et parashat hakesef asher Haman. And he also told them, why is Achashverosh doing this? Because he's being paid. He's being paid. So basically, the Divrei Shaul explains that he was hinting to Esther that Achashverosh was not motivated by ideology. He was motivated by money, and he could be bought. Unfortunately, that there's some leaders who can be bought. Or I guess in this case, it was fortunate that we could buy him off. And that, by the way, that's the end of the story, is that they do buy him off. If you look at the story closely. And hold on. Well, she says, Andy's saying that Esther couldn't go to Mordechai because she wasn't allowed to leave the Beit HaNashim, the house of the women, the harem of the women, unless she was called to the king. But I don't know that that's correct, because it says they're not allowed to go back to the king until they're called. But it doesn't say that they can never leave their house. And also, that's what it says specifically. Look at what it says. It says, it says in chapter 2, verse 14, you cannot come to the king again unless the king calls you. But it doesn't say that you cannot, it doesn't say that you cannot leave the house at all. And especially doesn't say that about Queen Esther. who she was the queen. Presumably she was allowed to, she wasn't a prisoner in the palace, but okay, so Wendy's arguing that historically women were never allowed to leave the harem at that point. I mean, I guess you can make that argument, but I'm not sure that that's the argument from the text, because later on it talks about how Esther did leave. It says at the end of the book of Esther, it says that what does it say? It says there, okay, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that, even though I'm not sure that Wendy's argument is necessarily borne out by the text here, but that's for a different discussion. Okay, so now what does Esther, so what does Mordechai say? He says, he's telling Esther about the money that he got by Yehudim le'abdam, and also ve'et patshegen ktav adat asher nitan b'shushan lahashmidam v'natan lo larot et Esther u'hagid la u'etzavot aleh lavo hamelech et chanenu u'vakesh mofanav al hama. So now he does something else, because he says that that Mordechai gives to Hatach the text of the letter. This requires intelligence on Mordechai's part, like secret intelligence. He gives there the text of the letter that was given in Shushan to destroy them. And he gave it to Hatach to show to Esther and to tell her about it. Meaning Esther didn't know about this. And to command him to come to the king, or to command her to come to the king, to beg from the king, to request from him about her people. See, from the text, we see here, it never actually says anything, because it says earlier what was sent out. That earlier there was a text that was sent out to kill all the Jews, but it's not clear that everybody knew about it. All we know is that there were rumors going around, but Mordechai had the actual copy of the text. And furthermore, the text was sent out to all the 127 provinces, but it doesn't actually say that it was given out to the people in Shushan. And now Esther was in Shushan. And now Mordechai is telling her, this is going to be given in Shushan. The Jews of Shushan are not going to escape. The Jews of Shushan might have thought that they could have survived, that they alone could have survived, because they are not like the country Jews. They are not like those Jews. These were, we're different Jews. We're friends with the king. And Mordechai is telling her, no, that you're not going to make it either, that this is an attack upon all the Jews, even the Jews of Shushan. That's the significant element here. Even the Jews of Shushan are going to be impacted here. And he showed this to Esther. He said, show this to Esther. Here's the decree against the Jews of Shushan. So that's what's so this is the way Al-Sheikh also reads it. He reads it a little bit differently than what I'm suggesting, but he says that Asher Nitan B'Shushan Lahashmidam. He said that apparently only the Shushan copy of the edict mentioned the Lahashmidam, to destroy them. The extent of it was fully laid out. Mordechai had this document which was not public till that point. And now everybody has this. Now he's showing it to Esther. He's showing her this public document. And Hasach reported the situation to Esther, the words of Mordechai. So Esther says to Hasach, she commands him to go to Mordechai. And she says, so now this is another thing I saw way too many times in my period as an activist. Yeah. So Nancy, what you're saying here is, that she wasn't allowed to go to the king, but that doesn't mean she couldn't have any other meetings. She could have had other meetings. So that's the point. But Esther now switches her tactics. She goes from saying, "Oh, there's nothing going on, there's nothing to worry about," to saying, "Okay, there's something to worry about, but I have nothing I can do about it. I can't do anything about it. Who am I? Who am I? There's nothing I could do." That's the other thing, that once you raise the problem with the people on the inside, the Jewish leaders, first their approach is to say it's not a problem. And the second stage is to say, okay, it's a problem, but there's nothing I could do about it. And so that's what's going on here. So she said, send this message to Mordechai, all the servants of the king, and the province of the king. Yodim, everybody knows that everyone who comes to the inner courtyard, that if a person is not summoned, everybody has one law. Unless the king will stick out his scepter, his golden scepter, you'll live. But if you don't do that, you're going to die. I have not been called for 30 days. And by the way, this is a beautiful teaching. So we see from here, of course, let me just stop for a second. Everybody says that everybody, it's known. Now we read this work as symbolic of our relationship with God. So when it refers to Hamelech, the king, it can also be read as a relationship with God. So it says, all the servants of the king and the provinces know that anybody who comes to the inner courtyard of the king without being called, that you can't go too far into the inner secrets, the too high spiritual level, to the inner courtyard of Hashem without being called. It's a very dangerous thing, unless God sticks out his golden scepter. And I have not come to the king for 30 days. So that means that if we want to be able to be on a good relationship with Hashem, we have to be very vigilant about the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, which is once every 30 days, to make sure that we're keeping that mitzvah so we can continue to come into the inner courtyard of the king. And so she's basically saying, at this point, I'm not able to do anything. Who am I to be able to do anything? I can't do anything. I'm a nobody. Vayagidu and Mordechai, Esther, and they said to Mordechai the words of Esther. And Mordechai's response is the response that is the most quoted line from the book of Esther, most often quoted line, and it's the following: Vayomer Mordechai la'ashiva Esther. Mordechai says, "Bring back to Esther. Al tadami b'nafshech mimaleit mi beis hamelach mikol mimaleit beis hamelach mikol hayudim." Don't think in yourself that you alone will survive from amongst all the Jews. If you will be quiet at this moment, success and salvation will come to the Jewish people from another place. What's that other place? From Hashem. And you and your father's home will perish. Meaning, say, she thought she was in Shushan, that her father's home will survive, but now she's learning that they're not going to make it. So his response to her is, first of all, don't think that you alone will survive, and don't think that your family will survive. They'll perish, but we'll figure out a way to make it. Maybe this is the reason why you have become king, why you have become queen. She says, so Rashi says, who knows if the king's family will want your family at this time next year. Meaning, say, who knows if you'll still be a queen a year from now? You won't have the opportunity. or who knows if you're being queen at that time will exempt you from this obligation. And don't think that you alone will have the ability to survive. Rashi says, now this is something to be, I want to just correct this, is a common mistake. Now, we always fast on the eve of Purim. Why do we fast on the eve of Purim? What's the reason why we fast on the eve of Purim? It's called the fast of Esther. Why are we fasting on the eve of Purim? She told the Jewish people to fast. But the fast of Esther, which this year we're going to do on Thursday because the eve of Purim is Shabbat, and we don't fast on Shabbat. The fast of Esther, when did Esther tell the Jewish people to fast? That was not the day before Purim. In the story, it was on Pesach. They were fasting on Pesach, which is 13 months prior to the eve of Purim, because on the eve of Purim, we were fighting a battle. So some say the reason why we do the fast of Esther is only because of the fact that we're fighting a battle and used to fight a war. Whenever there was a war, the Jewish people would fast as a sign of doing repentance. And Rashi says very specifically that what day was La'is Kazos, Shehuayo Omeid ben Nisan. That right now they were in the month of Nisan, and the time of the right Kazot means by this time next year, which will be the month of Adar. So right now they're having this discussion, 11 months in advance. So everyone who remembers that the fast of Esther was not in the Talmud, it was later addition to the Talmud. It's the only fast we really do, which is not mentioned in the scripture at all. It's not mentioned in the Tanakh, because the fast of Esther here took place on Pesach, and according to Midrash, it was on Seder night. And so that's what Esther was saying. So everybody can make sure to remember that. So that's what she says. Go back and bring this message to Mordechai. Go gather all the Jews that are found in Shushan. Vitsumu alai, fast for me. Fast for me 3 days and 3 nights. And by the way, I think that this year we have an opportunity to have religious, what's the word? Solidarity with the Jews and the Muslims, because the Muslims are fasting for Ramadan. The Jews can fast for Tanis Esther, so we could do a solidarity fasting together of Jews and Muslims to come together in this difficult time between Jewish-Islamic relations. We could bring everybody together by saying we'll fast together, and we'll have a break fast together on Thursday night. So if there's any imam who's going or Muslim activist who's listening to this discussion and wants to bring us together for a solidarity fast, give me a call. So she says, go gather all of the Jews and now fast for me and don't eat or drink for 3 days. And also me and my lads will do this. Me and my assistants will do the same thing. And I'll come to the king without permission. And as I perish, I will perish. Now, here, what does it mean against the law? The Talmud understands, meaning to say that now she's going to break the law, because up until now she had been forced to be with Achashverosh against her will, under duress, but now she's willingly going to do this. And she's going to go to him and offer herself to him in order to save the Jewish people. And this was not in agreement with the law. And the Talmud calls this an example of what's called a sin that's done for the sake of heaven. And Avera Lishma, a sin done for the sake of heaven. And that's why it says the Talmud, Kasher Avadati, she says to Mordechai, I'll no longer be able to return to you, because now that I willingly went and committed sin with Achashverosh, I'll be no longer able to return to you. And it says, Vayavor Mordechai. What does it mean that Mordechai passed? So this is also an interesting law. Vayavor Mordechai vayazka chol asher tztivel of Esther. Why do you have to pass? And so that he went and he broke the law Mordechai himself broke another law because he was not technically. So he technically broke the law. How did he break the law? Right. So here the Gemara Megillah says that Mordechai broke the law because the 3 fast days included the first day of Pesach, where Shmuel says in the Gemara that it means that he crossed the river that divided Shushan from the capital Shushan from the city of Shushan, and you weren't allowed to do that. Yeah, he wasn't allowed to do that. So he crossed the river. In any event, we're seeing that Mordechai was also breaking the law. So this is a whole thing in action of civil disobedience. Anyway, we just touched the surface of it, but we'll stop here if anybody has any questions.